This episode of the Leap Forward podcast is brought to you by Bridge LT, leaders in conversational learning and innovation. Through AI role plays, technical simulators, and comprehensive training programs, Bridge LT is revolutionizing the future of corporate and enterprise education.
Today on Leap Forward, we're joined by Dr. Alex Connock, an Oxford lecturer, serial entrepreneur, and media expert, to discuss how AI is reshaping the creative economy. Dr. Connock shares his journey from the behemoth magazine industry to the rise of streaming and the creator economy, defining the major shifts as we move from top-down decision-making to the democratization of content distribution.
Okay, so today on Leap Forward, we're joined by Alex Connock, Dr. Alex Connock, I should say, Oxford lecturer, serial entrepreneur, author of numerous books, including Entrepreneurship in Media Entertainment, Hits and Value Creation. Alex, you've spent decades at the cutting edge of the media industry. You've run production companies to teaching at Oxford and INSEAD. And now you're really fascinated in this whole idea of exploring how AI is reshaping the creative economy. So on the back of the fact that you've spent your career straddling the worlds of academia and entrepreneurship, what first drew you into the business of media, and why does it still fascinate you today?
Well, media is about storytelling. And since human beings began, storytelling has been absolutely critical to our understanding of the world and our enjoyment of our lives. And so at a sort of metaphysical level, media is a tremendous place to be. Secondly, it's a great business. It's a business where you can sit down in the corner of a coffee shop and write a script, and that script can turn out to be Jaws or Star Wars, and you can monetize that at a kind of infinite level from a very low initial investment. And so media is a very attractive business when you can get it right. And then a third thing is that media is heavily integrated into all the technological changes that befall us as we go through our careers. So I think about my own life. I started out in the magazine industry in New York, where at the time magazines were kind of the behemoth of the media industry. I worked for a magazine called People magazine, the biggest magazine in the world. And then since I've been in the industry, the magazine industry has almost completely died away. Same is true for broadcast television. Same is arguably true for cinema, for film exhibition. And in their place have come these tremendous things like the creator economy, streaming, and what have you. So it's an incredibly dynamic and involving marketplace where, on the one hand, storytelling remains as paramount as ever, but on the other hand, the means of distribution, the means by which we get that storytelling changes, and that creates incredible business opportunities and the opportunity to build extraordinary businesses.
And of course, we're going through another incredible period of change at the moment. Perhaps kind of just give me a sort of brief kind of sense of the major kind of paradigm shifts that you've sort of seen from that kind of first role kind of at People all the way through to kind of you discovering kind of ChatGPT in 2022 and it changing everything again for you.
Yeah, well, I think I define it by two big shifts. First of all, the shift from top down to bottom up. And so when I first went into the media, it was essentially the case that there was a group of people, often men, by the way, on Madison Avenue in New York or Fifth Avenue, Sixth Avenue in New York, making the decisions about what people got to see, whether that was via CBS News, where also briefly I did a work experience there, actually right back in the day, right the way through BBC, ITV in the UK, and the relevant channels around the world. So that was very top down. There was a small oligarchy, if you like, of people who were deciding what people got to see. And then as the internet came in, we saw that situation kind of reversed, where it then became the case that a kind of democratization took hold and everyday people were able to submit and circulate their content. And that became a kind of vibrant economy that we call the creator economy today, where channels from TikTok, Instagram, earlier Facebook, YouTube, obviously, probably most dominant YouTube now, were able to democratize the distribution of media such that anyone could become kind of a celebrity, a star, a media creator. And even more than that, they could monetize that and people could build businesses off the back of that. And you only have to look at Mr. Beast to see how that's been done. And then as we went into the early 2020s, I and lots of other people who were sitting in universities and I guess entrepreneurial businesses saw this thing, generative AI, coming down the line. Got into it in about 2020. It was kind of under the radar, but then in late 2022, sort of the end of November 2022, we saw ChatGPT come out, and suddenly that democratization took place as well, whereby everybody was able to become a creator, and that quickly became not just text, but also image and then video, such as with Sora 2, the new video tool that's out in the United States at the moment, or VO3, the Google one. And suddenly everybody has the tools at their disposal to do quite extraordinary storytelling. And so going back to my earlier answer, I think what's fascinating about the media business is that on the one hand, human storytelling is a kind of transcendental, permanent thing that we would have found 12,000 years ago if we'd gone to those ancient settlements in Turkey. But at the same time, the means of distribution and the means of production change almost by the hour at the moment. And that makes it a fascinating, thrilling, and above all, I think really interesting business opportunity, because each change creates new opportunities for value generation.
That's a great segue into my kind of next question, really, I suppose. You've been involved in numerous businesses, kind of a serial kind of founder and entrepreneur. And as you said, we're kind of entering this kind of new phase, and for the glass half full of us in the world, there lies in massive value and opportunity. When you think about the birth of ideas and that sort of, that founding energy and early stage lessons and risks that you took, in today's kind of AI driven economy, what does a good startup idea look like?
Well, I did a session at Oxford the other day actually with an investment banker who's specializing in tech startups, and he made a really good point, which was these days, if you're not an AI company, you're not a company at all. I think that you might say, well, that's a bit severe, but I think what he really meant was that because AI has changed so much about how we produce stuff and organize ourselves and organize logistics and administration and even creativity, unless you have some kind of AI strategy at the very heart of your business, you cannot really hope to succeed. And so that's represented a kind of fascinating reinvention around how companies are created. You can take that at the top level. Mark Zuckerberg famously said, we must disrupt ourselves before anyone else does. He said that in 2013 about Facebook, having previously missed the mobile phone revolution. And that's true of all startups today. Like you have to disrupt yourself in such a way that you're going to, in some level, be future-proofed. And that's pretty extraordinary. Chris Best from Substack said, a great extinction event is coming, whereby the old guard, the legacy media, will be swept away by a new generation of media companies that are very fleet-footed and are able to use that kind of highly efficient production and distribution to great effect. And so we're entering an environment, if you like, of great kind of dissociation between what used to be the case and what is now the case, and that's a febrile business opportunity. And so it's very exciting to cover that field from an academic perspective, and also to just be part of it and to see people creating businesses out there, and you can see it everywhere you go. And this is one final interesting point as well, which is a Mark Andreessen point. Actually, no, it wasn't Mark Andreessen, actually. It was Nikolai Tangen, who runs Norway's huge public investment fund, which eclipses, I think, even the Saudi Arabia public investment fund, some $2 trillion worth. And he said, essentially, if you can't stand still, there's no steady state here. So a compliance officer could kill a company just by folding their arms and saying, we're not going to go ahead. We're not going to do anything. We're just going to let everyone else do the AI. We'll be safe in this position. And his point is, if you take that decision, you're essentially ceding a 20% gain every year to everyone else. In a couple of years, you'll go bust. And so that dynamic environment is actually the perfect environment, really, to think about startups and how startups might come about.
And when we think about those startups and the opportunity in front of us, we're being challenged, and we're disrupting, existing products, markets, services, and even kind of business models themselves. How do you see sort of founders getting that balance right between kind of creative instinct and sort of ambition and vision with the kind of the hard kind of commercial discipline when starting out?
Well, it's really interesting because media is a very special area because nobody knows where media comes from. It's a really interesting point. There's a famous Hollywood quote, which is, in Hollywood, no one knows anything. It's a quote from a writer called William Goldman, who wrote the movie Chinatown back in the 1970s. And so we're dealing with an environment where no one quite knows where the intellectual property comes from, on which are built these foundational businesses. Charles Dickens said, an idea is like a ghost. it just kind of appears and you just see it. So what that means is that it's quite difficult to put a kind of factory in place to make ideas in the way that I might put a factory in place to make toothpaste, for example. I would know all the inputs and all the outputs if I was making toothpaste. It's pretty easy. It's not the same in media. So that's a disadvantage to media company founders, but also an advantage because it does mean you can have these magical insights that will then turn into potentially lucrative ideas. But then on top of those insights, you then need to layer system and process. How are you going to produce these things? How are you going to cost efficiently produce them? And above all, how are you going to distribute them? And how are you going to find an audience? Now, of course, startup founders today have a real advantage in media over the previous generation, actually my earlier generation of startup founders, in that they've managed to disintermediate the middle people, the decision makers. So now, if Mr. Beast wants to invent a business or a video, he can invent that business and video, stick it on YouTube, create an audience, get distribution, get advertising revenue, sponsorship revenue, merchandise, whatever, affiliate marketing, whatever it might be. And he doesn't have to go through the intermediary of an executive out to lunch on Fifth Avenue, in New York or whatever, making decisions about his own content. So there's an extraordinary opportunity now for entrepreneurs in the media to create value, albeit in a mysterious way that no one quite understands, and distribute that systematically distribute that such that they're able to monetize. And that's almost a unique feature of the media since about 2010.
So you're talking a lot about kind of what's changing. But when you sort of think about sort of the lessons, of your own startup experiences, whether that's 10 Alps or more recently kind of the Oxford Creative Industries Centre, what's remained the same? What are those kind of universal truths that kind of transcend this disruption we're going through?
Well, you've got to tell a good story. And that's true, of course, all across media, whatever channel of media you're talking about, whether it's a song or a movie or a TV show or a creative video or even an OnlyFans video, at some level, you have to tell a good story. And so that has ever been thus. And if we went back to the mid-19th century and sort of sat in a London coffee house with Charles Dickens, we would still find the same essence was there. You have to tell a good story. And there's an easy line of connection from there right through to a kind of Netflix hit series today. So that has never changed. And the other thing is you have to make sure that your story pertains to and relates to your audience in ways that are likely to generate engagement. So the nature of that engagement will change, and now the way by which you achieve that engagement will change. And today it's reinforcement learning and supervised learning and all these kind of sophisticated algorithmic techniques that affect how we show up on social media feeds. But the fundamental point remains the same, is that you have to create content that will engage. That might be true of a piece of business-to-business content that you're using to make your jet engine fuel relatable at some conference that you're going to, at some event, somewhere. Or it might be, a kids show, or it might be a song, or it might be a concert. You have to make yourself relatable, and you have to engage the audience. And so everything changes, but everything stays the same in the media business. Again, that's what makes it so fascinating.
Let's talk a little bit about sort of your book. And I think, a real kind of focus area for me was you talking about this concept of the IP generation economy. And, you talk about lone creators to global studios, and you talked about Mr. Beast there just now. How to build more on that. So how do you see value being created and captured differently today?
Okay, I'll tell you a really good example. So everybody now has access to this kind of hyper efficient, but also hyper derivative creation machine, namely generative AI, whether that's ChatGPT, Anthropic, Google Gemini, Runway, any of the many tools that are available, 11 Labs, that could go on. And so on the one level, we have access to a bunch of tools which enable us to apparently create new content. So that's a change. That's definitely a change, isn't it? But underlying that is a fundamental sort of philosophical point, which is that generative AI is entirely derivative. That's the whole point of it. It's a machine that has understood the statistics of previous distributions of words or images in the past, and is able to then recreate them in some kind of quasi-realistic way such that new content is created. But if you think about the great leaps of content creation that have ever taken place, Star Wars coming out of thin air in, I think it was 1977, Jaws slightly before that, Pokemon, whatever it might have been, these weren't a function of previous pieces of content, generally speaking. They were actually kind of brand new leaps of imagination. And so there's a strange paradox here, is that on the one hand, we have these tools of sort of quasi-creative tools that come from generative AI. But on the other hand, we still have to remember that it's actually the humans and human connection that really creates great content. And I think you can see that interestingly in the media landscape today. So whilst we can all get consumed by the idea that technology is taking over the media and that generative AI particularly is going to be super helpful, if you actually look at what's smash hitting at the moment in media, in a way, it's very offline and very old school. So you have the massive Oasis tour. Before that, you had the massive Taylor Swift tour. You have the fact that the 100 top TV shows in America were all National Football League. And so actually what people are connecting with is human experience, human relatability. And I think those two things are quite interestingly fused together in the sense that on the one hand, we're barreling towards a sort of synthetic future of kind of AI slop and all the material that we're seeing in our Instagram feeds from Sora 2 at the moment, of kind of crazy goings on people's doorsteps in kind of fake sort of ring camera footage. And on the other hand, people are going to Wembley Stadium or the Hollywood Bowl to kind of physically touch each other and physically touch the emotional experience. And so media businesses are being built at both ends of those spectrums. In a funny sort of way, we have a kind of expanding universe situation, kind of Big Bang moment when the universe of entertainment is expanding on the one hand out into live experience, on the other hand out into synthetic AI slop. And fortunes are being made at both ends of that, which is almost a unique moment in media history, I would say.
I love it. I love that sort of idea that it's a sort of a race between the two. And we've had previous races like that in the past around sort of the internet kind of acquiring kind of more advertising spend than traditional media and so forth. So, if you were kind of placing bets, maybe you're thinking on both sides, but is the next big hit more likely to come from an algorithm, or is it going to come from an individual, or is it going to become some sort of collaboration between the two?
I think all of the above. I think that's a really interesting point. And so quite often you'll get artists and creators at one level or another saying, I'm AI free, I don't touch AI, and it'll say kind of sent from my iPhone or whatever like that. And of course, they have very much touched AI in the use of it. They've used Adobe Premiere or After Effects to edit it, for example, which is machine learning. And so I think that the best media creative at the moment is still touchably and relatably human. And that's a fascinating point. All the big breakthroughs in content in the last year or two have all been very touchable and related to human, but they are being informed and facilitated by incredibly new tools, including generative AI and other forms of machine learning, which enable distribution at great scale via these amazing platforms like TikTok and YouTube. So we're not losing the original essence of entertainment and media startups being born of a wonderful human moment of creativity. On the other hand, we're also not denying the reality that the artificial intelligence and other technologies are facilitating that. We're achieving some kind of fusion of the two, and I think that's absolutely fascinating.
And you used the word synthetic there. What sort of role do you see synthetic actors like Tilly Norwood kind of play in shaping the next wave of content?
Well, I think the Tilly Norwood story, and for anyone who doesn't know, Tilly Norwood is a synthetic actor created by an agency who claimed, without any actual evidence, that they had major Hollywood agencies on their case to sign this virtual actor up. But Tilly Norwood's kind of emblematic of the reality now that synthetic content of all kinds can be created. And of course, that's not new because game engines have been using synthetic characters for 30 or 40 years. But nonetheless, I think there is something slightly new about synthetic actors. I think actually, to my mind, there's no panic about that. First of all, I don't see any particular evidence at the moment that people want to engage with kind of drama, particularly high-end drama involving synthetic actors. I think on the contrary, people, to my previous point, are even more engaged than they ever were in kind of real touchable people. But nonetheless, I think that the synthetic technologies that sit around the kind of Tilly Norwood as a kind of emblem of it are incredibly powerful and could be quite democratizing, because the media, certainly in the late 20th century, was a kind of oligarchical elite where people who'd been to kind of Harvard and Yale and worked in New York got to make all the decisions about what might work. And now, if every creator sitting at home in the Ivory Coast or rural Belgium or the deepest Finland has the ability to deploy these kind of visual effects tools, of which Tilly Norwood is a kind of quasi-human example, but actually those visual effects and VFX stuff goes much beyond creating humans, then all of a sudden more diverse and interesting storytelling could come from all over the world, and hopefully there will be a kind of kind of democratic ecology whereby everybody's story, whether they live in Nigeria or France or Britain or America, has an equal chance to penetrate the kind of global consciousness and achieve some sort of media reality. I think that's really exciting. And I think, you're located at the moment in the Middle East, and I think it's really interesting how the Saudi Arabia and the UAE are both heavily embracing the idea, not just of artificial intelligence in general, but also the growth of media, live media, the nexus between the two. And I think they're doing that because, first of all, they see it's a good business, but secondly, they see that it's an opportunity to reflect their cultures in a kind of direct and eponymous way, unfiltered by previous generations of kind of Western hegemony over what the kind of conventional correct storytelling was. And I think that's really fascinating. So I think, if you to put a positive spin on this, it's not an era of AI slop, although there is plenty of that around, particularly kind of short form deep fake. It's an era where new stories get to be told by people who didn't have access before, and other cultures than the kind of Western paradigm of what culture is in the kind of movies, for example, get to show up. And we're already seeing evidence of that in the boom in Chinese cinema, Saudi cinema, cinema from Africa, and so on and so forth. And that is a really fascinating place to be. That's why I love the media landscape right now.
Your positivity and enthusiasm is infectious. Let's talk a little bit about the sort of the human sort of edge side. And I want to kind of zero in a bit around this idea that sort of, AI can now kind of create and it can perform. What role and what sort of defining value then does human talent have in that kind of ecosystem?
Well, it's really interesting because so you've obviously got in front of the camera, if there indeed is a camera now, and behind the camera. Let's take behind the camera first. It's really interesting because I've just been writing and I'm about to give next week actually an Oxford lecture on kind of where are we with AI and employment. And it's a really interesting point because had you asked people sort of 2 or 3 years ago, what are the safe jobs going to be in the era of AI, they would have probably said kind of coding, technical jobs. If you ask people now, what they're more likely to say, that sort of those who are sort of in the know on this, is jobs which display empathy, human relatability, the ability to manage people properly, the ability to engage customers, sort of face to face and what have you. And I think that's playing out in the media too. So you're seeing a new layer of talent being required in media, which is even more empathetic and kind of relatable and touchable than was there before. And you see that played out all across social media, and there's absolutely no evidence of that declining in any way. And that applies behind the camera in respect of companies being better run and being more capable of touching their consumers in meaningful ways, whether they be Disneyland or some theme park in Abu Dhabi or a business to business sale of a TV show or a movie, and you see it in front of the camera as well. So again, going back to my earlier point, what I don't see is a media taken over by synthetic stuff to the exclusion of human connection. I don't see that at all. I think one thing that's interesting is if you look at the AI world, obviously, with respect to employment, extraordinary things have happened. So, a small number of high-level generative AI researchers, particularly those capable of building cutting-edge large language models, have become extraordinarily valuable, to the point that they're getting offered $100 million to sign deals. And I think that's evidence of a kind of global marketplace evolving. And I wouldn't be surprised to see that carry across into the world of media as well, in the sense that a small number of highly talented people who are able to bridge this new world between technology and creativity may find themselves extraordinarily in demand. And if I was taking a dystopian view, there will also, unfortunately, be roles within the media, historic roles, which will be less required. For example, translation is now increasingly automated, and that's definitely a concern. So we're going to see reconfiguring in the media workforce as a function of the arrival of technology in the same way as we've seen it in every other field, and we'll continue to see it.
And we've lived through this, right? We've lived through these periods of disruption. You cited that sort of at the beginning of this kind of conversation. So in one sense, kind of, this is nothing new, inverted commas. But let's just sort of focus a little bit on the people inside this industry and also the people leading them in this industry. So, you're a leader in this sector. All of this disruption's going on. How do you sort of maintain and cultivate kind of creativity and give some sort of degree of kind of philosophical or psychological kind of safety?
It's a really difficult one because if you do visit say a Hollywood studio now, which I have done actually recently, you do find real concern from people that traditional jobs are being eaten away at some level. Good example is I was listening to a show yesterday by Variety, which is the kind of Hollywood industry trade newspaper, and they were saying that a test had been run whereby script readers and AI script readers have been given the same scripts on which to do what they call script coverage in order to evaluate whether it was a good script for production. And that's obviously a very human skill to read a script. And interestingly, what they found was that both the humans and the machines gave very good redactions of the script and kind of descriptions of what the movie or the proposition was, and they were largely indistinguishable. And therefore, if you were looking at cost efficiency, you might say, well, let's use an AI. But when it came to answering the question, is this a good script to make a show into? Like, is this something kind of sort of intangible but real about this script that will make it a successful script? At that point, the humans were way better than the machines. And I think that's not by accident. I think that's exactly how things are going. So I think you will find that the more mechanical aspects of production in the media, let's say the building of an edit timeline after you've done a shoot with 100 cameras and you have to get that material into an edit timeline, that's something that would traditionally have taken an editor 2 weeks to do, but now can be done in 10 minutes by an AI. That's not going to be stopped. And there are other similar mechanical processes taking place. But where it comes down to, is this story relatable? Is this person on screen relatable? Is this a product that people are really going to buy? I don't think at that point, either in marketing, by the way, or in media, you're going to see humans replaced, because it's only humans that really truly know and can relate to other humans. And so we're going to see a changing of the disposition of who gets what job and what jobs are available. But I don't think we're going to see a wholesale takeover by machines of what humans do, especially in the media, but actually probably in many other fields as well. We could take a walk around Abu Dhabi and we could find a whole range of jobs where humans want to touch humans, in the sense of really meeting them. Hotel reception, do you want to check into a hotel where no one looks you in the eye and says, welcome to the hotel, Justin? Restaurant reception, chefs, all these things, these are not going to go away. And in fact, if we were taking a positive view of this, we would say that the humans are going to get to do more jobs that are more human touchable and more interesting, because the machines are going to be doing all the back office jobs. I'm not saying that it's quite as simple and elegant as that, but I think there is an element of that. And I think that would be the encouragement that would give people in the media. And then the second point I would make is that AI is very good at pattern recognition. That's what machine learning is. Machine learning is pattern recognition. But what you should be doing, therefore, if you're in the media trade, whether you're making EDM music or movies or TV shows or anything else, is not producing formatted stuff. You should be trying to produce original one-off stuff, because the AI can do the format. The AI can write me 1 million scripts for Friends episodes today if I wanted it. And it could actually, within a couple of months, probably will be able to make the show as well. It could arguably do it already. But what AI can't do is come up with the next Friends. And so actually the trend in Hollywood in the kind of 20 teens towards kind of a Marvel universe and endlessly repeatable formatted entertainment has already kind of run out of steam. And a lot of Hollywood studios now are saying, we really need to be making singular one-off new pieces of IP that are kind of wonderful and extraordinary and we haven't seen before. And I think that's the way things are going to go. So I would say to people in all forms of media and entertainment, do what you do best, create new concepts, new titles, new games, new videos, because that's what the AI can't do well. And that's the singular source that you've always brought to this, and you should carry on doing that.
When you're talking to your students, you're a dad, and I might ask you to give some advice to my kids as well. What advice would you give to them as emerging creators or executives kind of entering an industry in so much flux?
Well, I think the first thing is that if I think back to when I entered the industry, it was in flux then to a degree, and it's been in flux absolutely ever since. And so if we're talking about entrepreneurship or we're talking about media, you will always be in a state of flux. So what skills do you need in order to deal with that? I think you need literacy. You need some form of literacy with coding, but I don't think you need to be a coder. But I think there's lots of evidence that companies where everyone has some form of literacy with coding and prompting of AI systems and other computer systems is helpful. You need to really work on your people skills. And I think, everything that everyone I know in the kind of world of studying the changing world of employment says is like people skills are the thing. Being able to tell a story. So the great, one of the challenges in education at the moment is that students have this tool in ChatGPT which enables them, not that they would get away with it at Oxford, but enables them to just sort of press a button and get the essay. And to that, I would say, even if you can get away with that, that is the very last thing you should be doing in your education, because actually the skill you need is the ability to stand up and talk to a room full of people and persuade them to do something over a 20-minute period or whatever. And that's the skill that will not go away. And in fact, it might become even more important. And interestingly, in education, everyone's wrestling with, well, how do we deal with this world of ChatGPT, and how do we evaluate students when they can they can get all this generated content? And the answer is, you need to talk to your students. You need to have meetings with them. You need to hold presentation sessions. You need to make them tell the story for themselves. And so in a way, the way education is solving the challenge of generative AI is the same way that humanity should solve the challenge of generative AI, which is talking to people more, meeting them live and more, going to actual live meetings and conventions and conferences with them, making touchable events like the Oasis concert. Those are the skills that are going to be hyper important in the future.
There's been a lot of talk recently about sort of the AI bubble, and we've seen various bubbles over our respective careers, right, in this sector. But there's so much capital kind of pouring into this space. There's so much, some people would call it hype, right? Sort of, and that, kind of is a major kind of scale. I think you quote sort of, it's the equivalent of ITV every 4 days in your book. How can smaller studios and startups possibly kind of compete against that?
Well, I don't think competition is the right word, because of course the fabulous thing about this is these tools are available to you. So we're talking about media here today. So Jensen Huang, who, as you know, is the founder and boss of NVIDIA, which is the computer graphics processing unit company that actually kind of is selling the picks and shovels for this extraordinary revolution. He said, look, you should think about data centers as factories. And those factories are kind of these factories in the sky. They don't store our stuff. They just make stuff. And we have that as a kind of drawdown resource now. And so far from being an impediment to the small creator, actually, I would flip it and say the small creator now has the ability to draw down on that factory and deploy it in such a way that they can compete with the big people, if you like. And that's a big difference. If I went back to 1980s Hollywood, if you wanted to make a blockbuster movie, you had to have blockbuster money. And that's not necessarily true anymore. And so I think there's a real business opportunity there for people to kind of, again, to sort of level the playing field and to be able to create storytelling and sell it at scale. Of course, there's a second dimension to your question, which is that 75% of the world's venture capital is currently going into, broadly speaking, the construction and running of data centers. I mean, it's a bit more complicated than that, but that's basically it. That's where most of the money's going. Some of it's going on to model training, but the real hardcore money is actually going to building data centers and the associated power and electricity. And so if you make the kind of reductive argument that there's only a finite amount of capital in the world, and 75% of it is going to creating data centers, would there therefore be less for the kind of the production or the product development? Maybe there is. You've just got to be good enough to justify it. Of course, media has never been good at getting external investment. It's always been difficult. It's been difficult when you've been in the media, when I've been in the media. I've never enjoyed a period of media when people have gone, oh, it's so easy to raise money for my show, for my movie company, whatever it might be. It's always been a struggle, and I suspect it will continue to be a struggle. But what you have uniquely at this point, really, say the last 5 years, relative to all previous periods of history, is that you can now very cost efficiently replicate the production values of high cost media on a laptop. And so again, if I was being positive about the current changes, I would say this could represent the opportunity to create those kind of this kind of unicorn company, this their kind of paradigm of the one person, you're a unicorn. I don't think that's quite going to happen in media, but I think what is going to happen is that single individuals or small groups of people can create value that is dramatically outsized relative to the resources that they started with.
And talking about scale, once a kind of a creative startup really starts to gain traction, in your experience, kind of, and in today's context, I suppose, in a sense, what are the really smart ways to scale without losing your soul or losing your shirt?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things there. So I think the first thing is, I think, interestingly, again at Oxford, I've just done some lectures on the kind of basic tools of media distribution in the 21st century and how to understand them. And this is, three basic concepts in machine learning, which is supervised, unsupervised, and reinforcement learning. And each of those tools plays out in real time in your feed 24 hours a day. Supervised learning is where you educate the algorithm that what kind of content you like, and then it goes and finds more and then recommends it to you. Reinforcement learning is where an agent within the algorithm considers what to offer you next in order that it might get the highest propensity for you to engage with it, essentially. And if you can understand those things and therefore understand the way distribution is working, you're some way down the road to optimizing the distribution of your content when you are a creator making great pieces of art in a nice cottage in Wales or whatever you might be, or a Nigerian teenager making action thrillers on a mobile phone, whatever it might be. Understanding the mechanics of distribution is extraordinarily powerful and helpful now. Beyond that, you have to just do what people always in media had to do, is you have to understand creative engagement, storytelling, all the kind of original tropes of media distribution. So it's a combination really of the kind of old playbook that we would have found amongst novelists in the 19th century, combined with some understanding of the mechanics of algorithmic distribution. It was quite interesting. Do you remember a couple of years ago, Mr. Beast, his internal guide to how to manage the YouTube algorithm was leaked out, whether intentionally or not, I don't know. And it was a really interesting read, because what he essentially said was, I spent years of my life studying this algorithm. So it wasn't by accident that Mr. Beast became famous. It was by design, because he had knuckled down and really, in a certain sense, understood the algebra of the distribution tool that he was focusing on, which was YouTube at the time and probably still is. And I think we all need to do some version of that, whether we're a local newspaper trying to find a local audience to engage with, whether we're the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix trying to make sure that, we have the best possible attendance at the Yas Island, or whatever other business we are. We need to understand the mechanics of distribution. That, the tools which we're using have changed, but the fundamentals of that haven't changed.
I love it. That's it. That should become a universal skill.
No, I think it is. It's really interesting. I mean, actually, when I gave this recommendation algorithm course at Oxford, a couple of lectures, I mean, everyone was saying it's not a function of me being good at it. It's just this stuff is like this. Everyone should know this stuff because this is the world around. This is why you're being shown what you're being shown. And I think it's a sort of fundamental point of understanding that everyone should have.
You mentioned sort of the concept of a kind of a one person sort of unicorn. In the landscape that we're in now, do you think sort of exits in the media space are going to look different?
Well, that's a really interesting one, because exits have always been really difficult in the media space, because so much of the value in a production company is tied up with the people who founded that company. And so it's rather like advertising agencies. So, it's a mug's game, a fool's errand, if you will, to buy an advertising agency, because what you're implicitly saying is, you guys won all those customers and kept them all happy, and I'm going to give you loads of money, and then I'm going to let you leave after a certain point. And that's kind of a flawed model, because that almost invariably, with the acquisition of advertising agencies and production companies, when the original founders leave, so does some of the value, if not all of the value. And we could both cite 50 examples of where that's actually happened. I think the other dimension to media value generation is where the actual products themselves have value. If they're, the Call of Duty, which, as you know, has changed hands a number of times because it's a piece of IP that's incredibly potent, and most recently changed hands when Activision Blizzard was in the transaction for like $70 odd billion. So what one needs to do, I think, at this point in time, is create video games or TV shows or even creator feeds, which at some level are not singularly dependent on one human being the face of them. To the degree that you can do that, That's how you monetize. In music, you can create a library, a back catalog, and sell it for hundreds of millions of dollars. In video games, I think there was some huge number of transactions over $1 billion 2 years ago, and it was a bumper year for video game acquisitions. In other fields of media, it's the same thing. So I think if one goes to a board meeting for a media and entertainment company now, the first question on the agenda should be, what IP are we developing that at some level would be transferable? Because when you come to the valuation of companies, generally speaking, you can obviously start with things like discounted cash flow and price earnings multiples and things like that. But if you really want to score big on the exit from a media company, what you need is a brand or a product that has a kind of standalone value. And at that point, all bets are off in terms of what multiples are applied to it and what have you, because the buyer just wants that brand because they can then scale it across the Disney empire or the NBC and Universal empire or whatever it might be. So we need to be striving to create titles, songs, pieces of IP, formats that are capable of being exported beyond the original makers who came up with them.
And you've just launched another new book. I think I'd love to and you're still teaching kind of avidly right now. What sort of legacy do you hope teaching and writing is going to leave for the next generation of media entrepreneurs?
Well, it's a very nice question. I mean, I don't think I'll be deluding myself about leaving any legacy, but I can tell you that it is incredibly thrilling at the moment to be involved in this space. It's quite an interesting journey. So when I started teaching at Oxford, it was about 2019, and a very clever colleague, two colleagues actually, had come up with a great course idea called Business of Media, Arts, Culture and Entertainment. And when we did it in the first year, I taught it, and I think I had like 19 students on it. I was very pleased. It was a nice course, But last year I did it, this summer actually, and there were 100 students on it, and we were turning people away. And I think that's indicative of the fact that this Generation Z, as we might call them, have embraced the idea that media and entertainment is a viable career and a real industry. I saw a really interesting statistic that female MBA students think of media and entertainment ahead in the kind of league table of possible careers above finance, which is really interesting because finance is a very traditional MBA career. So I think that the business of media and entertainment, this subject that I'm absolutely passionately interested in, as are you, in fact, is something that just is growing, actually. And I think that that's a function of it being that much more important in society, it being that much more visible in our social feeds, and also, to my earlier point, about the kind of global democratization of it. So when I went into the industry, it was to a very large extent a hegemony of kind of Western values, if you will, or Western stories. And that really is not true now. In fact, if you're looking for cinema industries that are growing, India, Indonesia, and China would be where you needed to go, and certain places in Latin America, interestingly. It certainly wouldn't be America, and it certainly wouldn't be Europe. If you're looking for storytelling, there's fantastic new production companies and games production companies in Africa. The Saudi government is heavily investing in game production, as I'm sure you know, and has done some very big acquisitions, really. And they're seeking to grow a kind of really serious business around video games in the Middle East, and so on and so forth. So it's a really interesting, globally diversifying landscape. And that's absolutely fascinating from a sort of intellectual point of view, but also fascinating from a business startup point of view, because there's so much more opportunity. So, I would actually recommend, and I do recommend people to go into this space at the moment, because I think there's a future in it. And I think it's a really interesting place to kind of locate your ambitions.
Alex, what a fascinating picture you've painted today. I could talk to you for hours. I just want to thank you so much for joining us on Leap Forward. It's been an absolute pleasure.
No, look, I really, really appreciate you having me on. It's a great project, and anyone who's listening, by all means, reach out to me, LinkedIn or what have you, and let's keep the conversation going. Thank you.